The fourth and final clause of Clause 4 is called Information Security Management System. Now, as I just told you, it's the fourth and final clause of Clause 4, which deals with the context of the organization, and there is no mandatory piece of documented information attached to this lecture. Now, the required activity of Clause 4.4 is extremely short. In fact, it's actually just one sentence if you open up the standard and read by yourself. And it's basically about the organization establishing, implementing, maintaining, and continually improving its information security management system. It also highlights the need to define and manage the processes that make up the system and ensure they work together effectively to protect information and meet the organization's security objective. Now, Clause 4.4 is short, but very important. As I just told you, it requires organizations to establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve their information security management system. This is what I call the ISMS lifecycle. Now, in the very beginning, of course, you establish the system. That means you design it on paper. You then implement what you have designed on paper. And once it's implemented and running, of course, over the course of the years, you have to maintain the system. And that's the most important part. You have to continually improve the ISMS and get better year after year after year, learn from your mistakes, and just take the next step in the maturity ladder. Now, while the other clauses in ISO 27001 define what your ISMS needs to include, Clause 4.4 simply emphasizes that you must actually put these elements into action, keep them running effectively, and constantly improve your system over time. Now, this takes us back to the project plan. As you can imagine, probably all tasks are related to this subclause, since we are in the process of establishing and implementing an ISMS, right? But for the sake of simplicity, I have decided against including 4.4 as reference within each task. However, each task that is explicitly about establishing and implementing a process has been marked as related to 4.4. Now here in step 2, that's the case for the context analysis process, just to give you one example. Okay, so far we have determined internal and external issues, identified the requirements of our stakeholders, and derived a scope of our information security management system. Now, to establish and implement our management system, we need to establish and implement processes that meet the requirements of the ISO 27001 standard. So let's have a quick look at processes next. Now, what is the definition of a process? A process is a set of interrelated or interacting activities that transform input into output. Now, that's very theoretical, so let's probably just have a look at a quick example. Now here we can see a very easy process that consists of 3 activities. Activities are the actions, tasks, you name it, that transform something into something else. So with input in the context of processes, we're talking about resources, we're talking about information, we're talking about money, we're talking about anything that you put into a process where people or technology does some magic and transforms it into output, for example in the form of products, services, or other information. Now here you can see an example of a process depicted in the BPMN notation. BPMN is the global standard for business process modeling, and here you can see a process that is about a customer that's hungry and the customer is ordering a meal at a restaurant. Now, it's very important, you don't have to use this fancy style of visualizing your processes. ISO doesn't tell you what your processes look like. BPMN is a great way of doing it, but you don't have to. It's just here for visualization purposes, as it's very easy to understand what the process is all about, right? So, in developing the processes that I present throughout this course, I used ISO 27022 and ISO 33053 as my starting point. Now from this foundation I adapted and refined the processes to make them clearer and more practical, as ISO standards typically provide guidance in a highly descriptive and theoretical style. Now next up you can see an overview of possible processes that could be necessary to implement an ISMS in accordance with the ISO 27001 standard. Now it's very important. The standard only mandates you to have 2 processes, and that's the risk assessment and the risk treatment processes. Now that's the risk assessment and the risk treatment process. All the other processes are not mandatory, and technically you don't need to have them formally documented to pass a certification audit. But I think it's extremely helpful to have at least a set of processes that reflect the requirements of clauses 4 to 10. And these are the ones that you can see right here. Now, let me just get this straight. There's 2 processes that you need to have in the form of documented information. And clause 4.4 requires you to establish the necessary processes to implement and run the ISMS in accordance with what the standard wants. So you need processes, but you need to have them work in practice. And only the assessment and the treatment process has to be somehow formally documented in whatever form you deem as necessary. So in the end, it depends on how your organization works, what's best for you, and maybe also consider what you already have. So probably some of the processes that you need for your ISMS are already in existence.